because he's so omnipresent. It's the guy that actually can refer to the blogosphere as his own personal MySpace. But ladies and gentlemen, we've got Cory Doctorow up here to do our keynote this morning. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. How's my level? You guys hear me okay? A little closer. All right, I'll just kick my power out. And now I will fall off the stage. There we go. All's good. All right. Hi there. I'm Cory Doctorow, and I co-edit a website called Boing Boing, and I'm a fellow of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an organization that used to be my employer. And this year I'm the Canada-US Fulbright Chair at the University of Southern California, where I'm teaching an interdisciplinary group of students about DRM and the risks to it. And, you know, the funny thing is I don't have any credentials. I don't have a degree. I just kind of stuff because in 1977, when I got my first computer, I fell in love, and it's a love affair that never ended. When I held that machine in my hands, when I used it, when I used it to log on using the acoustic coupler to a PDP at a nearby university, I felt a rightness there, like a tool that had been made for my hand had come into it. And I think that that's common to the experience of so many of us. It was a machine that did my bidding. And as time went by, I found myself getting into programming, and although I was never a virtuoso programmer, and just as quickly as I started working as a programmer, I stopped, I found that there was no experience quite so thrilling as taking one of these amazing tools and getting it to do my bidding, getting it to jump and to buck and to do exactly what I told it, even when what I told it to do was wrong, and when I got those crashes and saw that I was an imperfect god to be in the universe. And I found, even though I was never a virtuoso programmer and my career didn't end up being programmer, that everything I loved moved into the PC, and it became an unparalleled tool for self-expression. And so as the years went by, I found politics and personal relationships and art and news and everything else that mattered to me had moved onto this platform, this open platform that anyone could play with, that anyone could move into. Things that the designers never envisioned were happening there. The law of unintended consequences played out and played out and played out, and every day my love affair with computers gets deeper and more profound. So we tend to forget in this era of PCs what the mainframe meant. The mainframe didn't just mean that few people had computers. It meant that nearly everyone who used a computer only got to use and see the screens and programs that some central policy authority dictated to them. Now, that's not to say that mainframes weren't important and useful. They revolutionized business and they revolutionized government. But mainframes were not something that an individual could modify, improve upon, understand, or use in the way that suited them. In fact, as the PC emerged, it became clear that the PC represented a dire threat to a mode of doing business, to the extent that people who brought their 8086s and their into work were fired. Right? They had to hide those machines under the desk because it was such a fundamental threat to the security model where a few geeks in white lab coats and the people who employed them got to dictate what all the losers could see and do, that it was important that anyone who challenged that be thrown out of the organization. The same is true of the internet. Right? The same is true of the internet because it replaced special purpose networks where every connection that you could make and every call that you could run was prescribed in advance. It was a default deny stance that prevailed in the networks that predated the internet. So that if you were Tim Berners-Lee and it were 1988 and you invented a protocol and a program and a server and you just wanted it to run on port 80, in the era before the internet, in the era of the balkanized private network, you would have to go and convince every systems administrator in every wiring closet that port 80 is to be opened, that HTTP to their business model, and that nothing bad would ever come as a result of HTTP. And of course, no protocol could ever meet that standard, and in particular where you have change-averse people who frankly have better things to do with their time than listen to your crackpot.com business model ideas, it's unlikely that you'll get port 80 opened in all the wiring closets. And since these are Metcalfe's law technologies, excuse me, I did the other dumb speaker thing, I forgot to turn off my phone. Let this be a lesson to you, turn off your phone. So, that said, we replaced the special purpose network with the general purpose network. And in so doing, we changed the world from a world in which you could only see the screens that someone prescribed and only run the protocols and talk to the people that some central authority prescribed, into a world in which anyone could communicate with anyone without any third party intervening using any technology or protocol that they wanted. A profound shift. And when I think about what causes me to fall in love with the internet, it's that. It's that every day, playing out all over the world, individuals are figuring out what works best for them and making it happen, making the machine buck and hum to their will and sharing their will with the rest of us and building out bigger and better technologies. By the same token, when the crypto wars were over, it seemed like we were on the dawn of a new era. It seemed like we were entering into an era in which not only could anyone communicate with anyone, but they could do so with perfect privacy. But today, the upstarts of yesterday, the people who organized businesses around capturing the value that was lost when they fired the PC pioneers, the people who figured out what crypto was good for and created commerce out of it, the people who saw the internet as something that was a useful and valuable tool, it seems like a lot of those people are turning into the people they replaced. Like the Animal Farm, when you look from the pigs to the farmers and back to the pigs, and you can't see the difference anymore. We're finding ourselves surrounded by an IT industry that increasingly takes it as its mission to figure out how to turn our machines and our networks into special purpose tools that respond to the will of people other than their users, where central policy can be dictated and enforced against the people who use the tools. So the worst practices of the technology industry are now being exported to other industries. So in software is kind of the birthplace of this terrible Frankensteinian monster called the EULA, the End User License Agreement. It was the first time that anyone really thought that you could do this terrible violence to the legitimate and noble agreement, right? That thing that happens when you and I sit down at a table and start with what we want and walk away with what we need. When you could take that and you could violate it and turn it into something so trivial, you can form an agreement merely by looking at a sticker, or merely by having a screen of text flashed in front of you, and that agreement somehow constitutes something binding, a waiver of the rights that were set up by statute and practice and custom in the service of enhancing someone else's business model at your expense. So we're seeing EULAs move into areas beyond software now. So for example, films. If you go to Amazon and you buy a movie from Unbox, you'll find yourself agreeing to a bunch no sane human being would ever form an actual agreement to. This is an agreement in quotes. And that agreement includes things like they can delete all the movies that you bought whenever they want to. They can dictate which devices you can play the movies on from day to day, from moment to moment. You can't sell the movies, you can't loan the movies, you can't return the movies. If the movies are never delivered to you, you still have to pay for them. You can't take the movies with you if you move abroad. You can't take the movies with you if you go abroad on holiday. Those rules are embodied in a EULA that is to a greater or lesser extent binding. But it doesn't stop there. The hardware industry has decided that the EULA is a great bit of kit to stick in their own toolbox. So I just bought a Lenovo laptop, and when I opened the box, I found an 8-page acquisition agreement that described to me all the things I'd agreed to by opening the box. Right? By dint of becoming a customer, I had formed. It's coming to television. So I was recently at a digital television standards body meeting in Europe, and a representative of the Motion Picture Association of America was there, and he was describing a system that he wanted to include in broadcast television so that certain shows would only work on certain outputs from your receiver. Right? So as you change the channel, bits and pieces of your home theater would go dark. And I said, well, you want to apply this to broadcast television, and at least in the US, which is one of the places he wanted this to apply, we have statutory rights around what we can do with the television we receive. And that's because broadcasters are corporate welfare bums. They don't get that they don't pay for that spectrum, that valuable, scarce electromagnetic spectrum that we turn into so much value. Look at that tiny little slice that Part 15 gave to us, where we have our 2.4 gigahertz applications and all the value that was created out of it. The broadcasters get the exclusive right to use spectrum that's infinitely more valuable, low frequency penetrative UHF spectrum, for free, And all they're expected to do in exchange for it is broadcast. And so we have rights to those broadcasts because they're in a sense, those broadcasts unfold on our property, our spectrum, the American public spectrum. So I said, that belongs to us. How can you tell me that parts of my theater should go dark depending on which channel I'm watching, depending on which show is on? And he said, well, it's true that you do have rights, but what if you decided to waive them in consideration of seeing a show that you couldn't otherwise see? Well, you know, waiving rights in consideration for value, that makes sense. That is one of the ways that we make an agreement. For example, if you owned an apartment and you moved abroad for a year, you might rent out your condo, and in so doing, you would waive your right to just walk in and start eating the food in the fridge in exchange for the rent your tenants would pay you. And I said, well, that's an interesting thing. How would you form an agreement to waive your rights to watch a show on a certain piece of receiver equipment? It's simple. You're watching channel 3 and you press the channel up button. Now you're watching channel 4 and you agreed. You agreed when you pressed channel up. Moreover, these technologies are now embodying something called authorized domain, which has become a very sexy subject in digital rights management technology. And the idea of authorized domain is that you further agree that you will only watch the programs that you receive on one household's worth of devices. And this seems like a lot more liberal than saying you can only watch your DVD on one device at once. They say you can watch it on a household's worth of devices at once. But it raises an interesting question. What's a household? Right? There are varying definitions of household that prevail in different parts of the country, different parts of the world. So while the people who propose authorized domain inevitably will trot out examples like, we can accommodate you if your household includes a minivan and a summer home, they never trotted examples like, we can accommodate family in Manila whose daughter works as a domestic in California and whose son is building buildings in Saudi Arabia. Right? That household isn't countenanced in their designs because they're not designing technology for those people. They're designing technologies for themselves. And what happens when you turn general purpose networks that anyone can adapt to suit their own needs into special purpose networks that are designed for the majority is that everyone who doesn't fit down that central mold, anyone who's a little bit true, and I think that includes most of us, is not accommodated by the plans. We all end up second-class citizens in the technology universe. It's coming to consoles. So if you buy a video game, you'll find yourself captive to a fairly corrosive business model, the razor blade business model, where you give away the handles and you sell the blades for more. In the case of things like the Xbox 360 or the PSP, what they do is they give away the hardware at slightly below cost, and then they make up the money by saying, only we can install software on this hardware, and we will sell the right to install software on your hardware. The stuff that you own, we'll sell that right to other people. It's kind of like being traded to another prisoner for a couple of packs of cigarettes, right? That's the core of that business model, and you find over and over again that these consoles are now being designed in a way that tries to prohibit you from modifying them, from understanding them, and that you agree to reverse engineer them, not to install code on them just by opening the box. We're seeing this, of course, in peripherals. Toner cartridges, another example of this razor blade business model where the toner cartridge often contains more intelligence than the printer, all of it aimed at keeping you from refilling the cartridge. Imagine if instead they decided to have a business model where they embraced figuring out how you could add value to a toner cartridge. Right? Think of all the things that people print with inkjets right now. You have people who print heat, right? People who print artificial cells with toner cartridges. You have people who print ARFIDs with toner cartridges. You have people who print sheet cakes. You ever seen one of those cakes with a picture of your kid smiling on the top? Sheet cakes with toner cartridges. What if instead of trying to restrict the value that you can get out of a toner cartridge, they tried to expand the value and make a stronger case for owning a certain toner cartridge by taking that intelligence that they're building into it now and letting the audience create more value? The way that today a PC's value is very little about the value that was added by the hardware manufacturer and almost entirely about the universe of services and programs and people you can connect to using their equipment. And now we're seeing it in cars. So it's not you who gets the EULA, but it's the mechanic, because your car has an obfuscated interface for talking to the engine, oftentimes, and a mechanic needs special piece of equipment in order to talk to your engine. And when she does that, she signs an agreement that says she won't order parts from anyone except the manufacturer. Right? So something that no statute would ever allow, if a manufacturer went to the Congress and said, we would like you to give us a monopoly not just on cars but on aftermarket equipment that might go into a car so that we can prohibit people from installing third-party equipment into the car, Congress would laugh them out because this is clearly bad for competition, right? We're supposed to have a this is a planned economy, or worse, it's a kind of throwback to the old feudal system where the king would give his favored subjects, monopoly on the production of silver ribbon or the color blue or, printing of the almanac. This is that kind of throwback, and no Congress would give it to them. But by adding a EULA, you can create this kind of private law. And really, what company wouldn't love to be able to write their own laws, enshrining their own business models into law? Your expense, at their customer's expense. And if all it takes is to put a sticker on the outside of the box that says, by breaking the sticker, you form an agreement, then who will refrain from doing it in the long run? Now, it's not just EULAs. The anti-copying, anti-use technologies that are sometimes called digital rights management technology, or God help us, copy protection. Now, I assume most of you are sysadmins or have been at one time in your life. Have you ever protected data by not copying it? Right? I my data by having an encrypted backup of it on a server in Australia. So if the hemisphere goes, my data survives, right? Now, these technologies are presented as technologies to keep honest users honest. Now, Ed Felton at Princeton says that's like keeping a tall user tall. The reason for that is that honest users, that is to say people who are naive or honest or moral enough to consume media that they buy instead of media they download from peer-to-peer networks, those people are the only people who get anti-copying measures in their media. In other words, if you decided to download a CD from eMule or whatever the kids are using these days, you're not going to get a rootkit from the music that you've downloaded. On the other hand, if you were to buy that CD from Sony, you might get a rootkit, right? So this isn't so much about keeping honest users honest as keeping honest users means, right? The people who haven't opted out of the system are the ones who get punished by the anti-copying measures. Now, ironically, this builds the case for opting out of the system, right? How many rootkits do you need to get before you say spending money is a foolish way to acquire media? Now, it's also built on a broken security model. It's built on a model that treats the owner of the hardware as an attacker. Now, first of all, as a technical matter, that's extremely difficult to pull off. The idea that you can restrict someone who's got physical access to the hardware in the privacy of their own home from gaining access to secrets embodied in the hardware is implausible in the extreme. But moreover, as a moral prospect, designing equipment that treats the people who shell out money for it as attackers of the equipment is bad for business, and it only works when everyone does it. And of course, when you have a copyright and you can say, I will only authorize people to play my music on their hardware if they agree to treat the owner of the hardware as an attacker, well, maybe you can, in fact, construct one of these airtight bubbles in which everyone who sells hardware designs it so the owner is treated as an attacker. You never so we treat the Sony rootkit as an aberration. We say, my goodness, they sure did lose control of their senses when they installed that rootkit on those millions of computers. Dan Kaminsky, who's, if he's not too hungover now, he found 500,000 networks that were infected by the Sony rootkit, including military and government networks. And we treat that as a kind of crazed excess on the part of, sort of coked up Hollyweird fat cats who lost control of their senses for a moment. But in fact, that's not aberrant. That is, the fact that there is a rootkit in the DRM tells you what the DRM is for. Now, why do we install rootkits on people's computers? We install them because we want to inflict policy on a computer against the owner of the computer's wishes. We want to inflict policy that the owner doesn't want to see running on it, even when the owner wants to do it. Right? So we try to do that, and in order to do that, we need to have software that hides itself from the user. We need to have software that the user can't uninstall. We need to have software that treats the user as an attacker. And there's a reason that the Sony rootkit did the same thing that people who want to turn your computer into a botnet do. The reason that the Sony rootkit owned your box. And the reason is because DRM is all about owning your box. It's about this idea that while you're playing someone else's record on your record player, it stops being your record player and starts belonging to someone else. It's not something we ever had in copyright law. Copyright law is supposed to be about who can copy your works, not who can design a technology capable of copying your works. Now, you can never secure a computer by designing it to enforce remote policy against the user. Right? I'm a science fiction novelist mostly these days, and as a result, I'm keenly attuned to dumb things that happen in science fiction media. And the dumbest of all is the self-destruct button. Right? Every now and again you'll see this in a movie. My goodness, they've tripped the self-destruct button and we have 30 seconds to get off the ship before it explodes. And you got to ask yourself, why'd you build a self-destruct button into your rocket ship? Gosh, that seems really dumb, right? Wouldn't your rocket ship be safer if there wasn't a single command that could make it explode? Well, why are we designing computers that can enforce remote policy against their owners? Wouldn't the computer be more secure if it were designed from the ground up never to allow remote policy to be enforced against its owner? So this gets worse. It gets worse as we see a kind of bizarro world application of best practices from security. So what do we do in good security? Well, we have renewability, right? We say security is a process, not a product. Eventually our security will be compromised. When it is compromised, we need to patch it. So what does that mean when you're designing an anti-copying system, an anti-user system? It means that at times, not at the user's discretion, their devices will be updated to revoke things that run on their computers, right? To change the rules that govern the use of their own devices. And not surprisingly, the revocation is never used to make the rules more liberal, right? It's a noose that tightens in one direction. So for example, if you owned a TiVo about a year ago, you had a device that could record any show ever aired. Then TiVo pushed out a non-discretionary security update. And that security update came from a company called Macrovision. And what it did was it changed your TiVo into something that responded to a flag called CGMSA. And that flag broadcast signals would say no recording, or recording only for 24 hours, or recording for 7 days. Now, there's no law about whether or not you can or can't record shows that are flagged record once, record for 24 hours, record for 7 days, no record. That's not the copyright law. This was a device rule that was established. It's like, imagine if your email had at the bottom of it a flag that said no forward equals 1, and then you could make a law that everyone who made a mailer had to look for that flag, and when they saw it, turn off the forwarding button, right? So Macrovision was pushed out onto the devices owned by TiVo users, and suddenly they had a device that was less capable. And that's not unusual, that's the norm. For example, most recently we saw the Fair Use for Windows Media patch pushed out by Microsoft, fastest patch in Microsoft history. And what they did was they revoked something that users had figured add to their devices. So if you owned a Windows machine and some Windows Media, you might have downloaded some software to let you do more with your music. Now, from a user's perspective, that's not a security problem, right? You don't worry that it's only you've suddenly found yourself with the ability to load your Windows Media music on your iPod. You don't say, I wish that someone will come along and patch this security vulnerability that allows me to do more with the music I paid for. But Microsoft pushed the patch out and advised users that this was patch. They actually pushed it out a little faster than they pushed out the patch for the vector graphics vulnerability that just came along. Although, to their credit, they did push out a patch for the vector graphics vulnerability ahead of Patch Tuesday. But they broke all speed records to get this patch out. And then the other elements of the tech industry that are being exported elsewhere, one is robustness, this idea that technology should be designed so that it's not user modifiable. Those of you who work source, those of you who work in the science of security, that is to say, disclosure, peer review, and analysis, understand that the ability to modify and understand your own equipment is fundamental to science. For 500 years, what passed for science was alchemy. And an alchemist was a lot like a scientist, except he never disclosed what he discovered. And as a result, for 500 years, every alchemist learned for himself that drinking mercury was bad for you, right? When alchemists began to publish did, the Dark Ages ended, and the Enlightenment began, and science arose. When you design devices so that their users can't modify, understand, or publish their results from them, then you start to claw back those vital norms that characterize the progress. And then finally, we're exporting anti-competition, the anti-competition that arose when we had software that was very siloed, and we had a lot of code obfuscation, and we had non-standardized data. We're exporting that into hardware universes and other universes. So if you buy an iPod and you buy $300 worth of iTunes music, Steve Jobs doesn't really care if you copy that music, right? Steve Jobs' DRM is not about making sure you don't copy the songs that you buy. It's about luring in the music industry so that when you have bought $300 worth of iPod music, you add $300 to the cost of switching to another brand, right? So I'm a user. I'm in the process of switching to Ubuntu but on a ThinkPad, but I've got a sad Mac tattooed on my shoulder. I got my first Apple in 1979, and even I know that Apple hasn't always made the best hardware in the market, right? I remember the Performance, right, as do many of you, right? It is absurd to believe that Apple will always make the best iPods. We know for a certainty, I'll bet you a testicle, though not necessarily one of mine, that at some point in the future, some manufacture an iPod-like device that's better than Apple. And it'll probably cost about what an iPod does, between $100 and $250. But the cost of switching from an iPod to a Creative Labs iPod will be $250 plus the cost of all the iTunes music you've ever paid for. Because what Apple gets with anti-copying software is the right to sue Creative if they make compatible hardware. So this is coming soon to a productivity suite and an operating system. You've probably seen the Microsoft ads with the dinosaurs. I can't believe I sent that email to the whole company, right? That they're proposing in the new versions of Office what they call information rights management. And this is like anti-copying stuff for your own stuff. And the idea is that you can send out email or other documents that you can control the printing, forwarding, copying, and ongoing reading of. So you can revoke the ongoing right to read a document. And the idea is that you've got a trusted client that makes a round trip to a key server and says, can I have a key to decrypt this document? And the key server says, sure, here are the rules that you have to respect when you decrypt it. So disable printing, disable copying, disable screenshotting, whatever. And when you're done, you have to discard the key. So you have to come back to me for another look at it. Now, the key word here is trusted. If you're not a trusted client and you get the key, you don't have to right? You've got a clear text, right? There's nothing about having the clear text that says you can't print. It's all about whether the client treats the clear text in some special manner. So, for example, with the iTunes Music Store, Jan Johansson broke the iTunes Music Store last year, and the way that he did it was very clever. It turns out they don't encrypt iTunes Music at the source. That's because they get these efficiencies in distribution by using Akamai. So every Akamai node has like a mirror of music store, and it's all encrypted to a common key. Basically, it's not encrypted. It's encrypted to an easily guessable key. And so they send you this clear text file, and then when it hits your computer encrypts it. Right? Your computer actually stabs you in the back when you get the file, and it encrypts it against your use of it. So Jan wrote a piece of software that impersonated the client. Right? Went to the iTunes Music Store and said, I am Doctorow@craphound.com, and here's my password, and I'd like to buy this song by the. And then when it got it and transferred 99 cents into Steve Jobs' pocket, it just didn't apply the encryption step, right? So that's what happens when you don't have a trusted client, is you can ignore those rules. The airtight bubble gets pricked and it explodes. So you need trusted clients for this to happen. Well, how do you enforce trust? Well, you get to license who gets to get your keys. So if before all it took to make compatible software with Microsoft Office is to reverse engineer their file formats, today, we're moving into a world where what it takes to be compatible with Microsoft Office is to get a license from Microsoft. That's a radically different competitive landscape to live in. It's one in which you get to choose who your competitors are. And who's going to choose a competitor that's going to put you out of business? Who's going to choose a competitor that's going to vitally disrupt the market? So it's bad enough for corporate drones to be info who don't get to own property, who have to be stuck in this kind of licensor ghetto. But it's even worse when we apply that outside to the rest of the world. Computer users aren't just people who work in big, boring insurance companies and banks as they were in the days of the mainframe. Computer users are all of us. And as we start to turn the general purpose PC and the general purpose network back into the private network, back into the special purpose device where policy can be enforced against users, to apply these rules not just to people working in boring companies in states that begin and end with a vowel. We start to apply it to everyone. So your users listen to you. You can warn them. You can warn them that when they buy high-definition video formats, they get a Trojan horse for smuggling DRM in. So the people who run DRM for high-def screens have agreed they're not going to turn on something called the image constraint token until 2010. Token that downsamples video when it's output on the analog outputs. And so what's happening is they're encouraging us to buy devices that have an anti-user measure in it, but they're promising not to use it until we've all bought the devices. Right? They're promising that we will never discover this Manchurian candidate until it's too late. So you can warn the users who depend on you. Next time when you go home at Thanksgiving, don't just install Firefox. Explain to them about HD. You can tell them about EULAs. You can tell them that the Media Center PC treats them as an attacker, won't let them record some shows, and in the case of the Comcast PVRs, is actually capable of deleting your library of stored programs before the DVD comes out, as happened with 6 Feet Under last year. You can warn them against the new Office suite. You can warn them about all of this stuff, and you can fight back yourself. The best security in the world is to have a civilization built on freedom and on fairness, where we can all bargain, and in a place where our negotiating position isn't waived merely by breaking a seal. You can join EFF, a nonprofit civil liberties group. They don't pay my salary anymore, but they pay the salaries of some amazing people who do amazing work. I don't know if you've heard, but it looks like they're going to overturn the NSA wiretapping program at AT&T real soon now. I'll thank you on their behalf. The Free Software Foundation, whose Defective by Design campaign is at least trying, right? They're building the first worldwide movement to do something about DRM. And while it may look a little weird to just have 7 people show up at the Apple Store in San Francisco, imagine if I told you 10 years ago that people would show up, even 7, in cities across the world to protest anti-copying technology in their music players. How odd that would have sounded. These guys are starting a movement that's going to become something big and worldwide. You can write code. You can write good code. You can write code that enhances freedom instead of taking it away. Some of you probably work for companies that want you to design stuff that treats the owners of technology as an attacker. And you can talk to your bosses, and you can talk to your line managers, you can talk to the software architects about whether or not that's a good idea for their business and for society. And you can refuse to agree. You can refuse to allow those EULAs to bind your behavior. I'll take some questions. Thank you. Questions? It was all self-explanatory. Nothing controversial at all. Yes, sir.
How can we convince businesses that piracy won't be rampant?
Well, I think that you need to reframe it. So the question was, since DRM's security model is fundamentally broken, you give people the ciphertext and the cipher and the key, and you expect them not to render a clear text at will. What do we do with companies that piracy won't be rampant? I think what we need to do is we need to encourage companies to view the fact that the internet makes copying easy as a virtue instead of a vice. And there are people who are adapting their business models to it. And in the same way that there were people who adapted their business models to radio, right? There were people who believed that Marconi should be forced to redesign the radio so that you could charge admission to it, because that was the vaudeville business model. You can't come into the hall unless you pay someone $1, and if you don't pay them $1, they throw you out. right? And they said, well, go back to the drawing board and give me a radio I can charge $1 for every time I give a performance. Now, the people who folded their arms and demanded that the world reconfigure itself into a way that was more hospitable to their traditional way of doing business ended up driving taxis and flipping burgers. The people who said, let's figure out a business model that treats the fact that anyone can receive radio, that a well-functioning broadcast system is one in which you receive it at the highest fidelity over the longest distance on the widest variety of equipment. The definition of a good radio, in the same way that the definition of a good internet is that it copies many bits quickly with the least control at the most and the most speed and the most faithfulness. Sure. Right? Those people eventually got rich. And so we have some artists who are pursuing this. You have people like the Techno Brega artists in Brazil, the largest new music forum in South American history, I think, who basically they give live performances, they're DJs, and they let people give away their music. And not only do they let people give away their music, that have been doing, they actually had a key realization, which is that if they let people sell their music, then the people who were essentially advertising their live shows would put even more energy into it than they would if they could only give it away. And so you can buy Techno Brega music and the money doesn't go back to the Techno Brega artists, but they perform. And the way that they find their residual income is the way that almost all of us find our residual income, which is that they take the money they earn and they put it in a 401k, right? Or they buy a house, or they do whatever. After all, royalties are not a great way to guarantee a residual income. 98% of the works in copyright aren't available commercially. 97% of the people with a recording deal are earning $600 a year or less with it. So if we're going to say, well, what will happen to my residual income? The answer has to be what residual income? Right? If you're relying on your copyrights to carry you in your dotage, you better get used to eating cat food. Right? A smart artist is one who has a backup plan, a plan B, in the instance works don't form the tiny minority of work that are continue to be economically viable decades after their initial production. There are other people who are doing this. In fact, you could argue that the people who sell music through the iTunes Music Store are making money without DRM, in the sense that iTunes Music Store music isn't sold because it has DRM in it. Right? No one says, oh, I could download from eDonkey and pay 0 cents, or I can download from iTunes and pay 99 cents, but the iTunes has DRM, that one's for me. Right? The 1.5 billion tracks that they've sold have been sold in spite of the DRM, not because of it. And if you want to build a business case for selling more work, you need to start by offering a better value proposition. I have 15 minutes, thank you. Other questions? Sir?
The infinite copyright situation that we're facing these days?
Additional on infinite copyright. So copyright is extended every 20 years or so by the entertainment industry lobbying for it. Is there anyone here from the UK? No? Sorry. If there were people here from the UK, I would tell you to go back and talk to Parliament, because they're about to extend the copyright on British sound recordings for another 45 years. That happens all the time, and it happens all over the world. And it's bad news. It's bad news because for most of us, 45 years after our work is created, 100 years after our work is created, and more, and in this country now it's the life of the creator plus 75 years, which, you know, if you created it when you were 15 and you died at 80, that's a long term of copyright. Figuring out who you need to talk to before you can reuse that work, before you can bring it back, archive it, put it back in the stream of commerce, make a new work from it, is almost impossible. And certainly costs more than you'll ever hope to earn from those works. And so as a result, the works languish, right? You might have a piece that you think would be interesting to use in your new transformative work, but figuring out who you need to pay, let alone paying them, costs more than you'll ever be able to earn back from it. So what that means is that the library is burning in slow motion. All that film made before the first Mickey Mouse cartoons is turning to slime, and we can't bring it back because for so long as those early Mickey Mouse cartoons, not Mickey Mouse himself, right? Mickey Mouse is a trademark. He'll exist in perpetuity for so long as Disney is associated with him in the public mind. But those early 5-minute shorts, for so long as they remain in copyright, all those other works disappear. It's a kind of radical denuding of the marketplace. And there are a lot of bad things you can do to artists, right? You can plagiarize us, you can rip us off, you can leave us to die in penury, you can write nasty things about our books on Amazon. But of all the things that you can do to artists that horrify artists, I think One that for which we reserve a special creeping horror is the spectacle of the mountain of books on fire. It's being removed from the public eye. It's being removed from the public sphere. It's being forgotten by history. And there's nothing that will guarantee our being forgotten by history than by creating this field, unnavigable minefield of proprietary interests around our work. And that's getting worse, not better. So for example, WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, is embarked on something called a broadcasting treaty that would create a separate right, not just the copyright, but what's called a broadcasting right. And that broadcasting right would accrue to people who transmitted information, including in the webcasting right, people who transmitted information over the web, not the creators. Right? So you might have the creator's permission, or it might be in the public domain, or it might be fair use, or it might not be copyrightable, like C-SPAN. The stuff your government makes, they can't copyright. That said, you will still have to get permission from someone whose creative contribution to the work was electromagnetically modulating it. And those people get a 50-year monopoly over the reuse of the work. So even if you can track down the rights holder, you have to secondarily track down the person who sent you the copy, and you have to clear it with them too. So I think it's really important that we hold that back. The next term extension fight is due soon. It'll probably be within 5 years or so that we're going to start seeing the next term extension fight. And I think that we all need to come to the barricades. And if you sign up for EFF's mailing list, Effector, you'll get notice when that stuff starts to happen. And for those of you who are in Europe, you need to start looking at what's happening with phonogram rights, performance rights. Other questions? Sir?
A moment ago, we were talking about radio, and you said that the people who came up with a new business model based on radio's ability to reach as many people as possible became rich, and those who could not create a new business model failed. Weren't the people who created that new business, aren't they the RIAA and Clear Channel today?
Yeah, you've hit a really interesting nail on the head there. So the question is, aren't the people who came up with the new business model the RIAA? Well, they are to a certain extent. In fact, that's the history of copyright. The history of copyright is yesterday's pirates become today's admirals, right? So just give me a sec, I'll get to you. So, you know, when the first record players were invented, the composers didn't think of performance as an important piece of the music industry. An industry is art plus technology. Anything else is just craft, right? So they had an industry, they had a printing press, so the composers could write sheet music and print it and sell it. Performers followed the instructions they wrote down, right? They were viewed as kind of trained monkeys. And so when the people started making record players that allowed a performer to perform a composition and then charge money for the recording, the composers went berserk. John Philip Sousa went to the Congress in 1908 and said, if these infernal talking machines to continue, man will lose his voice box as we lost our tails when we came down out of the trees. Right now, many points to Sousa for being an early advocate of the still controversial theory of natural selection, right? But he was wrong, right? It was good for the music industry as a whole to have this to have this piracy, right? To legitimize this piracy, to have a business model that legitimized it. Now, along comes radio, and the people who make records say, well, what we did was what those assholes are doing with the radio, that's theft, right? You've got to keep them out of the market. And again, because Congress tends to be reluctant to be known as the elected lawmaker who broke the dominant form of entertainment in their country. I mean, there's a lot of bad things you can do to Americans and they'll re-elect you, but break their TVs and, you know, God help you, right? So lawmakers made radio legal, so the broadcasters now became the admirals. And along came cable, and what did cable do? Well, it stole broadcasts and put it down over the wire. And what did the broadcasters say? They said, those cable guys, they're pirates. What we did was progress, right? Well, then along comes the VCR. And the people who were the cable industry turned around, pointed to the VCR, and said, what those assholes are doing, that's piracy. What we did is progress. Now, who legitimized the VCR? Sony. Who put the rootkit on our computers? Sony, right? They're admirals now, and we're pirates. It's in the nature of copyright that the law never encompasses use invented when the law was written. That's because you've got to ship code if you're a lawmaker. You can't sit around and speculatively imagine all the things that someone might do with technology in art, right? If you were doing that, the heat death of the universe would precede the signing date of your code. You need to ship, and then you need to do a 1.1 release when the new technology comes along. And so historically, we do revise copyright law to accommodate new technology. The big difference today is that we have last year's admirals holding the line against this year's pirates. And this year's pirates need to understand that they are next year's admirals, and they need to fight for the legitimacy of the way that they acquire and use copyrighted works. Peer-to-peer networks are the largest libraries of human creativity ever assembled. They're the way that the majority of internet users consume art. To say that peer-to-peer networks should be stuck back in the toothpaste tube is not only unrealistic, it's immoral. What we need to do is figure out how to minimize peer-to-peer. So one thing that's been widely proposed is that ISPs could opt into paying a license fee for their users that would confer on them the unlimited license for their users to download using whatever protocol and whatever software they wanted, any music they wanted, and that music would be statistically sampled and it would be paid back to artists. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because it's how radio works. No DJ picks up the phone and has his $400 an hour lawyer talk to the $400 an hour lawyer at Sony BMG to discuss whether this needle drop is going to cost 15 cents. They pay a blanket license fee, and in exchange they get the unlimited right to play music. Right? Well, why can't the American public get the same deal from the people who control those copyrights as the people who run radio stations? And why can't we get a better deal? Right? Those old ASCAPs and BMIs, those collecting societies, were conceived of in an era when it was all pen and paper and really easy to make some money disappear. You know, you might have heard Sound Exchange can't find obscure artists like Public Enemy to pay them the royalties they owe them. Why can't we form collecting societies that look more like Flickr than like some back end at EDI, right? Where there's transparency, where it's really easy to figure out what's going on and where the money is going. And in fact, the International Music Managers Federation wrote a great paper called Characteristics of a 21st Century Collecting Society. It's basically a requirements document for that collecting society, that piece of software. I think we could really solve this deadlock. Instead of criminalizing tens of Americans, instead of depriving them of their life savings, I think we could actually solve the problem. And if you go to EFF.org/share, you'll find some detailed proposals for this, including links to works by a professor at Harvard named William Terry Fisher, who's written a lot of great research on this. You know, if half the music fans in America were paying $5 a month for downloading their music, you'd triple the profits of the music industry, and we could portion that out not just to RIAA members, but to artists directly. You had a question? I hit it. Right. Dan, and then I think we got a wrap.
How do you connect your comments so far to around like open technologies and IP law to net neutrality?
How does this connect to network neutrality? Well, it's a good question. Network neutrality is a really thorny problem. You know, basically, we have a comparable situation to what happened with the broadcasters, where the network operators are, in the main, corporate welfare bums, right? They got a priceless treasure, the rights of way into our basements. Right? Imagine if you tried to individually license the right to run a wire into every house in America, what it would cost you, and how, not laying the cable, but negotiating the permission. Right? They got a law that allowed them to run the wire into our houses, and in exchange, we're supposed to get some value out of it. And what we're supposed to get is a neutral network. And what they're proposing, they're going to be able to charge high tariffs to some content providers instead of others. And the best example I've heard of it is Craig Newmark from Craigslist wrote a little piece that was quoted on CNN where he said, imagine if you picked up the phone and called Massimo's Pizza down the block, and instead of connecting to Massimo's, you got a message that said, due to Massimo's is not paid for high quality of service and guaranteed delivery of its phone calls, you can either hold for 3 minutes or connect to our preferred Domino's. Right? That's the network neutrality fight in a nutshell. The problem is, I think, figuring out how to keep these guys in check. I'm not convinced that if we put the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission in charge of it, that we'd get a good outcome. Not because we shouldn't be regulating their ability to do this, but because those entities are readily captured by the industries they regulate. You know, the career trajectory of an apparat at the FCC, you get appointed when someone from your party gets into the presidency. You get appointed as part of the administrative turnover, and then when that presidency changes hands, the other party comes in, you leave and you go work for the companies who you've been giving sweetheart deals to through the whole term. And so those aren't people who are really good watchdogs on our behalf. There's one thing I do know, and it's that it's really hard to figure out whether or not a network connection is neutral. And we need that as a first step to whatever we're going to do, whether it's a market a regulatory solution, or some kind of combination thereof. And right now, it's really hard to figure out whether your ISP is fiddling your network. You know, I just moved here from London. I now live in LA for a year. And there's a host in China that I could never reach. The reason I couldn't reach that host in China is Sprint had a year-old fiber break they were still advertising a route on. And Sprint provided BT Internet with its route to China, and BT Internet resold to my carrier, and so I couldn't get to China. Right? Neutrality problem, but it's still a problem, and it's opaque to the user. The only reason I could distinguish between this host being down and this host being, and my network provider being screwed up, is because the people in China kept emailing me this stuff and saying, we figured out what's gone on, and here's a proxy you can use to route around it. What we need is a distributed tool that we can use to take the temperature of the internet from millions of different locations, something like the Storm Center, but more user-driven, more like the Google, something that lives on all of our computers and tests on different protocols, on different ports, to different hosts, how the internet is providing, and makes that data set public so that multiple people can take it and crunch it and produce it. It would be useful to know, even if your ISP isn't fiddling, if they're incompetent, before you sign up for them. And this is one way you could find that out. So I think we're out of time now. I'll leave you with another implication to join EFF, EFF.org. Thank you very much.